just two quick announcements. There were those speaker release forms that is just to say, you're okay with them, filming you. And as far as I remember, I don't have to read this. It's just for internal use, like for specified people. And then I say, well, everything. You don't have to sign Skype and everything sort of thing. So there are those speaker release forms here, and maybe all of you guys who are speaking, you should have signed that. We did not sign it. And the other thing is for the hike tomorrow, we need to know how many people are going to be there so that we can organize whether we need 2 cars or a van. So we're going to pass a list of people.
And also the destination that was listed on the program was changed. So the plan is to go to 10 trucks. Actually, there's some pictures taken from 10 trucks outside here. I don't know if you've noticed them, so that's the new destination.
Actually, for those of us who have to leave before that, is there a shuttle after lunch tomorrow to go back to the hotel? Okay.
And you already know the restaurant recommendations on my webpage, right? So you know where to eat tonight.
No.
Well, they're a little out of date. There's a couple of new places.
Go to Chris Moore's website and find out where all levels of, from poor postdocs to like rich professors, there's something.
I admit it might be a little biased towards the
Okay, but we'll figure it out.
If you like bourbon, there's a really good place, great place to where you went to your last night. They have food.
Okay, those are all the announcements.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm chairing the session, so I'll introduce David. David Doty is, I guess we're kind of academic cousins in a way. So he worked as a postdoc in Eric Winfrey's lab at Caltech, and actually got his hands wet doing experiments, which
And the floor and a lot of other stuff.
It's messy.
It's a bloodbath there.
Yeah, he's actually now currently just started his own group at the University of California, Davis, and I'm kind of jumping around here. You did your pre-doctoral and doctoral training at Iowa State.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that's a mix of computer science theory and experiments.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's everyone. That's all we need to know.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Sean. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. I'll say I think my talk is going to be a little more like Sean and Paul's this morning and less like some from yesterday in that it's less science, which is like studying natural systems, and more engineering, where, okay, we have to understand natural science, but the real to build artificial systems that behave the way we want. Right, and I'm from this community called molecular programming. Sean is also a part of it. And the idea is we want to build molecular systems and engineer them to do what they want, or to do what we want, and to do it sort of automatically without us having to mess around with them too much. And I just said, I don't study a whole lot of natural systems, but I sometimes get inspired by them. So this is a video of a white blood cell chasing a bacterium around. And it's doing some kind of sophisticated computation to pull this off. And the question is, how is it doing it? And at a very coarse level, if you really squint, it's some combination of chemistry and geometry. So chemical reactions are altering the concentrations of enzymes and other molecules in the cell. And on top of that, the cell is using physical structures like cell membranes or microtubules to sort of spatially organize those molecules. And I want to focus just on sort of the first of these two basic primitives, and just understand in a completely well-mixed system that doesn't have these physical components to keep it from being well-mixed like a cell does. What is the basic computational power of chemistry? Right? What sorts of computations could it do? And what really interests me is what kinds of things can it provably not do? And so to ask and answer such a question, we need a model of chemistry, and luckily we have one. It's over 100 years old, called chemical reaction networks. And briefly, it's a list of reactions among abstract species, right? So I'm not thinking of water or sodium or anything here. Just there's some molecule R. It's a reactant, and that reaction means it might spontaneously decay into two products, P1 and P2. Right, or you could have a bimolecular reaction. So if an A and a B collide, they might stick together, and we'll call the result C. You can have a catalyst. X might change a Y into a Z while remaining unchanged itself. You might see a reaction like this, which appears to be violating conservation of mass. This is a shorthand for an A and a Z might collide and turn into some unreactive waste product that we won't bother naming because it's unreactive. And similarly, if you see a reaction like this, one X can, produce a whole other X. This is shorthand for there's some anonymous source of fuel assumed to be supplying the matter necessary for this to happen. And each of the reactions has a real number associated with it called a rate constant. I'll tell you a little later how those are used, but actually in a lot of this talk we're not going to use them too much. And we want to know what behavior is possible in principle for chemistry. And like I said, we have numerous examples from biology, which has used it to do amazing things. But there's things that we can write down that don't correspond to chemical reactions happening in a cell, and that's just reactions you can write that look like the ones before. And my real interest is somewhere in here, where maybe not every reaction you could write down actually describes how some chemicals behave, but we don't want to be constrained by biology just because we're inspired by it. We might find there's behaviors that are easy for chemistry even though it's not what biology does. So there's some questions that need to be asked at this point, and one is, I'm trying to claim that we can program chemistry, but a perfectly reasonable objection is to say, just because you can write down a list of chemical reactions does not mean you can go out in the world and find some chemicals that behave that way, right? So what good is a programming language if you don't have a compiler to turn it into something that executes it? And a very strong answer to this objection came a few years ago when David Doty and some colleagues showed how to use a basic sort of fairly well understood physical mechanism called DNA strand displacement to essentially implement any chemical reaction network in the following sense, that if you have some abstract reaction like X1 and X2 turn into X3, you can design some DNA strands, and I apologize for us in the DNA nanotechnology community represent DNA strands as arrows. So don't worry about what the DNA is, but that's 3 DNA strands that look like arrows that represent these 3 abstract species. And you design some other DNA, some single-stranded stuff, some double-stranded complexes, and the reactions that these things actually undergo, which you're not supposed to understand because I didn't tell you what DNA strand displacement is. Well, they will have the effect of consuming an X1 and an X2 and then producing an X3. So there's a sort of a sense in which these are implementing that abstract reaction. And so there's a certain sense in which, to an approximation, we can look at this diagram and really say, well, geez, if we can find a formally definable chemical reaction network that does something interesting, we actually could, in principle, go out and find chemicals that do what that does. So it's a good programming language to use. Okay, so I've tried to argue that we can program chemistry. Should we? Right, what's the point of doing this? We already have a perfectly reasonable way of automating computation with semiconductors, right? And a lot of people sometimes hear this, they think, we're trying to do this very fast. Somehow a quadrillion molecules in a test tube can do some massively parallel computation that would be faster than electronic computers. But really the sorts of computations I'll talk about, they're quite a bit slower in chemistry. So this is not what we're after. And you might think, they're so small, right? These biological molecules are in the order of tens of nanometers. But so are the latest transistors. So this is not what we're going for either. So here's a reason to think about computing directly with chemistry, and it's that some of these chemicals are sort of naturally compatible with executing in certain environments where it's not at all obvious how you would deliver an electronic computer and have it carry out the computation. Right, so for example, a smart drug that executes a computation in a cell based on that cell, and it would be a different output depending on the cell conditions, and then only releases a drug under certain conditions. Like it senses, this is cancerous, right? So this is like one of these killer apps that we hope for several decades down the line. And a very solid step in that direction was done by the guy sitting over there a few years ago. when Sean and some of his colleagues showed how to design this DNA structure that carries a sort of chemical payload inside of it, and then if and only if two proteins are present to open it up, it delivers the payload. So it's an end gate, essentially. Okay, so I've tried to argue that we can compute with chemistry and that we should. So what do I mean by that? What does it mean to compute with chemistry? Well, chemical reactions can have a wide range of behaviors, right? They can sort of execute Boolean logic based on the presence or absence of certain chemical species. If you're an electrical engineer, you might look at them and see time-varying signals and think, we should process those and do frequency filtering and so forth. A lot of people work on this. Chemical oscillators have been known for over 50 years. And the sort of thing I'm going to talk about is essentially something like simulation of discrete algorithms in the sense of programming languages you would write. And something I'll touch on is a related idea I'll call analog computing, which is essentially computing on real numbers. Yeah, so Eric Klavin's group did some of this, and what they were doing was, I think did they have? I don't think they had like a frequency filter. There's like the band pass filters, like let only the low frequencies. I don't think they got that far. I know some theory work that somebody at Minnesota did in that vein, and I actually just blanked on the specific thing Eric Klavin's did in the lab, but. Yeah, so if something's going up and down, you want to process it, right? Yeah. Not sure what I mean. I do these two in red. So, but, I should have read more of Eric Klavin's papers before I threw this up here. But,
it is probably concentration. If you're in low concentration, low frequency gas.
So.
And high concentration, high frequency gas. If you're chemical reaction at work, then the concentration will change. Either be so fast or not.
Yeah, you just make something happen based on the time series of the input, the same way you do when the input's an electronic signal. That's a goal. I'm not saying I know how to do it, but I don't know how to do it with electronics either. Okay, so I want to define a little more formally what is the model we're going to use, and this model will be our definition of chemistry, right? And this is often called the stochastic model of chemistry, which is a name I don't like too much because you can do non-stochastic stuff with it. I'll just call it the integer-valued model, right? So it models the amount of each chemical as an integer. How many molecules of each species are there? So we assume we have some finite set of species with uppercase letter names like this, and some finite set of reactions, indicating how reactions turn into products. We're assuming a well-mixed system here, so the state of the system is entirely described by just a vector of integers, non-negative integers, saying how many of each species do you have. And if the state is kind of implicit, I'll often use this pound notation to mean, pound of x is the number of x in the current state. And each reaction we assign a rate to. The rate is just a number proportional to the count of the reactants. And that rate constant there, that's the constant of proportionality. And if it's a bimolecular reaction, then we divide by the volume as well. Right? Because if you had a bigger volume, it'd take longer for two things to find each other and collide. Okay, so that's a number we assign to each. And then the idea is what's the system going to do? Well, you might have a lot of reactions that are possible. So we just say that the probability that some reaction is the next one is proportional to its rate. Right? It's just the rate and then divided by this to make it a probability. And if you want to know how long it takes, and I'm not going to talk too much about time in this talk, but if you want to know how long is that reaction going to take, it's inversely proportional to the rate. It's an exponentially distributed random variable. And actually, I'm not actually going to spend much time worrying about these. I will a little at the end, but you'll see why when I get through the next few slides. Okay, so I said we want to do computation. So because these counts are non-negative integers, a perfectly natural computational task to think about is to compute a function that takes integers as input and produces integers as output. Right? So there's a function, f of x equals x over 2. And I want to compute it. So what do I mean? Well, let's suppose I have some species named x, and it's special. It kind of represents the input. And there's some other species named y. It represents the output. And let's assume the state I start in is the one that has little x copies of species big X and none of y. Well, okay, so I want to go through some sort of inferior ways of computing this function before I talk about better ways. So here's something reasonable. How about if x just changes into y and the other way. Then what's going to happen here? Well, it's going to be something like x turns into y, but then y can turn back into x, and the rates of the forward and reverse reaction here will balance when they become equal, which will happen about when y gets to half of x. But it's not stable. They're going to keep bouncing around forever, right? So it'd be better if we could find some system where the value of y would actually, go to the value we want and then just stay there, right? So we might try reactions like these. So could turn into y, but it also, with equal probability, could just decay into nothing, right? Then about half of them will turn into y, but not exactly half. What will happen is that the expected value of y, is half of x, but you're probably not going to hit exactly that expected value. So it stabilizes, but not always at the right value. Right? We could, and if we somehow got the rate constants wrong here, we wouldn't even have the right expected value. It would go to something else. So here's a similar function. F of x equals x squared. And we can use kind of a similar trick to try to compute this. We'll have, two x's can catalytically produce a y, and also y decays. And what's happening here is that, notice the count of x never changes, so the rate of this is always just x squared. But, and that produces a y. And there's this other reaction consuming a y, and its rate is whatever y is, so this ought to stabilize when the count of y gets up to x squared. Right? And it's similar to that first one, where, it stabilizes when it gets around there, but it keeps bouncing around. All right, so here's a question I want to ask. I want to say, what kind of functions can a CRN compute when we don't know, or for some reason we can't control the rates? So, well, why would this be the case? Well, maybe that solution is not initially well mixed. So maybe some reactions are happening a lot faster than you think, because the reactants are locally concentrated in some part of the solution. Well, I told you about this method for implementing arbitrary CRNs with DNA. And it turns out that the easy part to get right there is the stoichiometry, meaning you want to consume the reactants and produce the products. But actually getting the rates to be exactly what you want is actually a big challenge sometimes. So that motivated us to think about, okay, what could we do if we don't have that level of control? Right? What can we do if, we don't get to control the rates? We just know the system's going to keep going, and we don't know which reactions will happen, but they'll just keep happening. Okay, so that motivates the first part of the talk, which I'll call, by a couple names, rate-independent CRN computation, or there's a similar idea in distributed computing. They call it stable computation, and in our first paper on this, we called it deterministic computation. But maybe that wasn't the best word. There's this other model of chemistry, the real-valued so-called mass action model. It's often called the deterministic model, but I don't like that name because it's a deterministic model, but there's others. So that's not what I'm talking about here. What I mean is I want it to work no matter the rates of the reactions. Okay, so here's a function. F of x equals 2x. Right, similar to the one before. And I have, my input species and my output species, and I start with x, and I want to, what's a reaction that code that in the count of y? So it's not a rhetorical question. I'm going to make you think now.
X goes to 2y.
Yeah. Each x decays into 2y. There's just one reaction. As long as it just keeps happening, when it's done, you'll have twice as many y's as you started with x's. And it'll stabilize there. Okay, here's that function we tried to compute before and failed to make it rate independent. So how can we do it in a way where it won't depend on the rates?
2x goes to y.
Right. So every time two x's collide, they turn into a y. And I'm assuming x's are even here. Otherwise, it's like a floor. Okay, how about if we have two inputs? So two input species, x1 and x2.
But you need to do something to make this thermodynamically favored so it won't run backwards, right?
Yeah, so as I said, we're sort of assuming an anonymous supply of fuel that supplies kind of the energy and matter needed. These are not detailed balance reactions by any sense. I mean, they're all irreversible, and so.
Okay, so yeah,
that's an assumption of the model, is that we don't require that,
Part of the rules of the game.
yeah.
You control the rates on the level of it being irreversible. That's all the requirement.
Yeah, and I mean, there are certain reactions that are effectively irreversible. If two DNA strands of length 30 come together in the right salt conditions at room temperature, they're bound for infinite time, despite what, and for effectively infinite time, despite thermodynamics saying, eventually they'll come apart, but not really.
So the matrix said that you can implement any chemical reaction network, you mean with this irreversibility attached?
Yeah, I mean, we're assuming certain strand displacement reactions are themselves irreversible. They aren't. It's an approximation.
And you have to assume that in the actual experiments they keep removing the waste products. You have to
No, they just build up. But you got to supply enough fuel. Yeah, we're not violating laws of physics here. We're just assuming you give enough extra stuff to avoid violating it. And in this part of the talk, we're just assuming you can do that. This is programming at a higher level of abstraction. So,
X1 goes to Y and X2 goes to Y.
right. So now you got two reactions. They might happen in whatever order, but no matter what order they happen in, eventually everybody just changes into a Y, and you get the sum. Right? And if we can compute the sum, it seems we ought to be able to compute the difference. Let's assume here x1 is bigger.
X1 goes to 2y and X2 goes to y.
So that will do 2x1 plus x2. So you're right, you can do more general linear functions.
X2 plus y goes to nothing.
And what else?
X1 goes to y.
Yeah. And so again, we want the amount of y to scale with x1 like before, but that might make, too many of them, right? So just imagine all these happen. We got too many y's, we got to get rid of some. How many? The number of x2s. And then we just eat them up.
So, but the other thing you could do is say X1 plus X2 goes to Z, and then you run that until you're done, and then X1 is the value of F.
Aha, you run that until you're done. That sounds like you want to control the rates.
Well, but again, I'm trying to understand the rules of the game. I thought in every case you sort of run this until you're done.
Well, okay, so sorry, you want to do x1 plus x2 goes to z, and then what's the other reaction?
Nothing else. It's just that I want to encode the output of F in X1 at the end.
Ah, okay, yeah, you're right. That's absolutely right. If we allow ourselves to let some of the input species also be output, exactly that would happen. That the excess x1 would be the difference. So that's another way to do it. Okay, so those are all linear functions. So you might start thinking, maybe we can just do these linear function. But there's a decidedly nonlinear function. How can we compute that minimum? Right. It'll keep happening until the smaller one is gone, producing the same number of y's. And of course, if we can compute minimum, it seems reasonable to think we could compute maximum.
That's X1 plus X2 minus the minimum.
Exactly. Right? And those are all things that we've seen how to do, right? We can compute the sum. Only we have to keep doing computation, but the first one ate the inputs, right? So we store them in backup variables, right? And so these decay into y and some primed versions of themselves so that we can compute the minimum of those. Right? And then we store that result in this k. It's k because it's a killer, and it has to kill that many y's to do the subtraction. Okay. So you might start wondering about other functions at this point. Right? We saw a rate-dependent way to try to get x squared. Could we do it in a rate-independent way? Or multiplication, or exponentiation. Or we saw linear functions that had rational coefficients. They were integer coefficients, but you can generalize that. Could we do something like x times root 2? And I'm not very good with suspense here, so I'll just ruin it. No, you can't do these. Right, so we can characterize precisely what are the functions that can be computed in a rate-independent way. But before I tell you what it is, I have to tell you what I mean. So I've been sort of giving this project in chronological order the way it happened, which is we figured out a lot of this stuff, then we defined what do we mean exactly by rate-independent computation. So I think you get a lot of intuition from these examples. But it is good to know what's the actual formal definition of not depending on the rates. It's this. We have a task, and it's that given some non-negative integers, x1 to xk, we want to compute a function of those. That's a non-negative integer. And we will represent them in the initial state of our CRN by having those counts of these species that are named kind of after the inputs. And maybe there's other species. We allow those to have positive counts. The trick is they just have to be the same in every initial state, right? You're only allowed to vary the inputs, but you can't change the counts of other stuff, or you could sort of cheat and maybe bury the answer in it. And if you're in some state S, the output of that state is just the count of how many y's are in that state, right? But it could change. So we want to formalize this idea that eventually the count of y stops changing. So we say that a state is output stable if it has the property that all states reachable from it. By reachable, I mean states that you can get to by applying 0 or more reactions to that one. All those states, they got the same output. In other words, whatever reactions can change the count of y, in this state they've all shut down, and they can't ever happen again. And so what we mean by computing this function in a rate-independent way is simply this. For any state S that you can reach from the initial state, there's a correct output stable state, that's reachable from that. So we have this initial state. This is not a species here. This is a state, so a vector species. And if it's possible to reach from there to some other state, this arrow means, do some reactions and you can get to here. Then yeah, maybe it's not stable yet, but there is some stable state reachable from there, and it's correct. Its count of y is actually equal to the output of the function. Only maybe we don't go to, maybe we go to S2 instead, right, if the rates are different. But from there, we can reach to O. Or maybe not. Maybe we go to some S3, and from there we can't get to this O. But what we're saying here is that there's some output stable state with the same correct answer reachable from that one. So this is what we mean by saying we can compute this function. So with that definition in mind, I can state the sort of main result here, which is that a function is stably computed, in this sense, by a chemical reaction network, if and only if it's what's called semi-linear, which is a definition. I'm not going to get into it too much, but just think of it as like piecewise linear. So sort of some finite number of different linear functions depending on what your input is. So like minimum is a piecewise linear function. It looks like two linear functions, for example. Okay, so that's the characterization. And remember, I said this was for this model where we have integer-valued CRNs. We're modeling the amount of each species as an integer, just saying how many molecules of each species are there.
I'm sorry, Dave, can you go back? Do you say anything about if and only if? So you're talking about if you're not piecewise linear, you cannot.
Right. So for example, x squared, that's not piecewise linear, so you cannot compute it in a rate-independent way. Okay, so I just restated the theorem here, but then there is this real-valued version of the model. In a separate project, we looked at the analogous question there, and it turns out we get a similar answer asking what are the functions computable with real-valued concentrations. And there, it changes a little. We get that such a function is computable if and only if it's piecewise linear and on top of that continuous, right? So it's in some sense a bit more restrictive, right? So it just means it's a union of hyperplanes is the graph of the function, and it's continuous. So when you switch from one to another, they got to meet. Whereas in the integer-valued case, like here's an example of a semi-linear function. You can have it be one linear function if the input is odd, and a completely different linear function if the input is even. So I'm not sure exactly what it means for a discrete valued function to be continuous, but that sure doesn't look continuous. But it's something you can do in this model. Okay, so that's what we know about the state of rate-independent computation. And one way to think about rate-independent computation is that you get the right answer with probability 1. There's some caveats there if anybody's thinking real hard about that. But let's just say it's that you're basically guaranteed to get the right answer. So what if we allow a small probability of error? Or in other words, I mean, what do the rates mean? They affect the probability each reaction is selected. So what if we allow the result of the computation to actually depend on the rates, right? And then just insist that with high probability we get the right answer. And I won't keep you in suspense. It's we can do a whole lot more, right? So if you allow this small probability of error, then these integer-valued CRNs are so-called Turing Universal. So what does that mean? Well, informally, it means that you can simulate any algorithm, right? So just pick your favorite programming language. Say you like Python. You can take any Python program you want. You can turn it in to a list of reactions, and what they will probably do is simulate that Python program perfectly. And so one implication of this, and I got this from my friend Damian Woods, and he says he got it from Chris Moore, and I asked Chris about it the other day, and he suggested I'm kind of overstating the case here, but I'm, so take this with a grain of salt, but the general idea is that in general, not for any CRN, but in general, if you want to predict the long-term behavior of a CRN, or in this case, predict what it's likely to do, you cannot do that any faster than just by simulating it and seeing what it does. Because if you could, then this would contradict these results that we have in computability theory and complexity theory that says you cannot predict what algorithms are going to do except by running them, right? And so I really wanted to drive this point home, but now I'm embarrassed because I realize I overstated a bit. But anyway, just if you don't remember anything else from this talk, remember this, that if your physical system has the ability to simulate arbitrary algorithms, and some very simple systems have this ability, it immediately implies that in general, you can't tell what they're going to do except just by running them and seeing it. You can't short-circuit it and just get some easy-to-evaluate formula that's going to tell you what it'll look like a million steps from now. You got to run it a million steps. Yep?
I don't think this is overstated.
Oh, okay.
Unless the simulation has a terrible overhead, like Gillespies one-counter machine.
Oh, boy. All right. So...
I mean, a time overhead. I guess you have an overhead in that the concentrations
Yeah.
are exponential.
No, but it's funny you bring that up, given the next slide. That's why I laughed. Yeah.
So by simulating in this case, you just mean evaluating the equations.
Yeah, flip coins to figure out which reaction, execute it. Oh, repeat. It's called Gillespies Algorithm is the name of it for chemical reaction networks, but I'm trying to state it so it applies to general systems.
And can you make the term small precise? Is it a small error?
It means you give me a Python program and a probability of error that you want it to be bounded below, and then I will generate a CRN for you. And if you make the error probability you want smaller, I got to change the CRN. Actually, it just means I have to start with more of a certain species, but the initial state will depend on the probability of error you want. Okay, so the way we're going to do the reason I chuckled just now is we're going to pick an extremely simple but very surprisingly powerful model of computation called a counter machine or a register machine that it turns out is itself Turing Universal. It can simulate any Python program, subject to the caveat Chris brought up. It does it kind of slowly, but and these turn out to be very conducive to simulation by reactions, right? So what is a counter machine? Just think of it as a very simple programming language where you only get one kind of data structure. It's called a counter or a register, and it's just a non-negative integer. So just think of it as a bucket you can put balls into. And maybe one of them is designated as the input counter. It starts with some balls in it and the rest don't. So that's the memory of this programming language, and the logic is equally simple. It's got two instructions. You can increment or decrement the counters. That's it. Right? You just start at the first line, and you go. You decrement R, so one ball goes away. And you increment S, right? And do it again and again. Then you decrement T. Okay, I left out a detail. If you try to decrement a register and it's 0 already, well, you can't decrement it anymore. So really, when you give a decrement instruction, you got to give one more piece of information beyond the counter. you also have to say, well, if it's empty and I can't decrement it, I'm not going to go to the next line. I'm going to go to some other line. So I have this conditional branch here. So because t is empty, instead of going to line 6, we jump back to line 1. And we decrement r, and then we increment s again 3 more times. T is still empty, so we jump to 1. R is now empty, so we jump to 6, increment s, and now we're at the end. We halt. And if you stare at this, you can probably convince yourself this program computes the function f of n equals 3n plus 1. But the amazing thing is that with the right set of instructions, you can actually turn any program you want into a counter machine. In fact, with 3 counters. You only need 3 of them. And you can do any function computable by any algorithm with this thing. So we're going to show that a CRN can simulate one of these, which means in turn, a CRN can execute any algorithm. Right?
Actually, 2 counters suffice, right?
3 counters suffice for a direct representation. So, for example, there's a 3-counter machine that can start with n and r and end up with 2 to the n and s. But there's no 2-counter machine that can do that. There's one that can start with a very strange encoding of n and r and put that same encoding of n. But there's actually a paper out there Damien pointed me to that says there is no function, and there is no 2-counter machine in general that can do it with the direct representation. So, okay, so why are we using these? Well, they got these non-negative integers that look a whole lot like counts. So don't stare too hard at this counter machine. It's just there to provide some instructions for us to translate. But it has an input register r that starts with value n, and we start at line 1. So the way that will correspond to a CRN is that we'll have an initial state with n copies of a species r, it represents that register, and a single copies of a species L sub 1, and its presence indicates we're on line 1. Right? And so to execute this instruction, increment r and then go to line 2, we have a reaction. L1 changes to L2 plus r. Right? So we now have L2, we don't have L1, we're on line 2, and we have 1 more r than we did before. Right? And this instruction is decrement r, so it's similar. L2 is going to change to L3, but it's going to eat an r before it does that. Except maybe there's no r. If there's no r, this won't be possible, and we don't want to go to line 3 anyway. Right? We want to go to line 1 if there's no r, so we have this reaction as well. L2 can change to L1. And that's it. There's only 2 kinds of instructions. So the rest is just, keep imitating that, but with different indices here. Right? So CRNs can simulate counter machines. Do you believe me?
Well, you have to make those, if not reactions, much slower.
Right. That's exactly what we need to do. Right, so what I said is if R is gone, we can't do this reaction, but L2 goes to L1 will happen. That's true. What if R is not gone? That second reaction is still possible. But if it happened, it would be an error. It would mean we did the jump, even though R was positive. We don't want to do that. So to make sure that it probably doesn't happen if there's an R, we want these reactions to be very slow. Exactly right. So how can we slow down a reaction? It turns out I didn't talk much about time complexity, but it turns out these unimolecular reactions in some sense are the fastest ones. So it's not just that it's not slow, it's actually that it would be significantly faster than this one. So how can we slow down this reaction in a sort of controllable way? Well, we'll just use this thing we call a clock. Right, so this is a couple more species, a C0 and F. F means forward, because if F encounters a C0, it pushes its index forward to 1, or it could push 1 to 2. And we also have n copies of some, right, where n is big, some species B. It means backward. It pushes you back. C1 to C0 or C2 to C1. And so what these 2 things are doing is they're essentially introducing this sort of random walk on this index of C here, and it's heavily biased in the reverse direction. The more B you have, the more it wants to go back. And if you crank through some of the probability and algebra and some of the assumptions I didn't state about exactly what the volume should be, let's say it should be like volume n, then if you start with a C0, you'd expect to wait about time n squared before C2 appears first time. And so here's how you can slow down reaction L2 goes to L1. You just make it require C2 before it can happen. And when it does, not only does it change L2 to L1, but it resets the clock. You go back to C0. And so by way of comparison, again, I didn't really justify why this is true, but it falls out of the definition of time. The expected time for that reaction it was competing against, that thing was, in the worst case, at most n, right? And so there's a sense in which it's much more likely you would do that one first than this other one. Okay, so, all right, so the summary here is we have these two models, integer valued versus real. And if we want to do a rate-independent computation in one, we can do exactly these semi-linear functions. In the real valued model, it's a similar answer. We can do these piecewise linear functions, but they got to be continuous. And if we allow the integer valued model to depend on the rates and have a small chance of error, we can do anything that any algorithm could do, right? So our computational ability goes vastly up, right? These things are sort of very weak. And the obvious question is, what about a rate-dependent CRN processing real-valued concentrations? I don't know. I actually don't know the answer to this question, but I'm interested in it. Okay, so the conclusion here is that chemical reactions can be designed. They can be programmed to process information that are encoded in the counts or the concentrations of the chemicals. But that if you want that to be robust to the rates happening differently than how the standard model might predict, then they become very limited in ability, these so-called piecewise linear functions. But if you allow a small probability of error, it vastly expands your ability to basically anything any system could do, which is what programming languages could do. And the key challenge here is sort of representing information without geometry. Like, just compare this to a standard programming language where you'd be processing bits in memory. The bits appear in some order, and these two bits are next to each other, but they're not next to this one. But this is like a system in which the bits might just float away, and then all you know is how many ones you have and how many zeros. But so it's kind of amazing, frankly, to me, you can do anything at all. But you can. Okay, so these are my co-authors in some of this work. And I also hope you notice I presented some work that wasn't mine. This is a kind of half tutorial. Anyway, but thank you very much.
I was wondering, so to process this 4 lines of code, basically, you require a lot of different species. And I was wondering if you analyze the complexity that is required